Yeah. Fino? Yeah.
Oh no. Yeah.
Okay, some people are starting in following in Zoom. Okay.
Where are you guys from? Colombia.
I'm from Colombia. Yeah. We could almost do it in Spanish again.
Almost.
This is the first event we do in English, huh? The first we yeah
No, we have a lot of people watching in
yes,
English,
yes. There is
Yeah.
people online that only can follow in English.
Lisa
And-
speaks every language except for Spanish.
Yeah. It's true. It's true.
She's Mongolian.
You speak Mongolian too. Kalmyk.
Part of the Mongolian family.
Yes. Yeah, and also we want to start to do more events only in English like this. Other people can come. Yes. And okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Sara.
Thanks for
We are
having me.
very, very happy.
Do we need to
We
record, by the way? Oh, it's
yes, we are recording already. Yes, we are recording. And
we might want to set the screen, like the view, so that it's on us.
yes,
So it's
exactly.
Yes.
Yes. This pin. Okay. See, no?
Then down.
Like this and this.
Yeah.
Muy bien. Okay. Like that. Okay. And some people will send messages. Okay. Okay, muy bien. So, well, we will start. If it's recording to you, it's perfect. I found your profile. I saw your company online. I started to be interested about what you do. You work with linguistics, which is something that everyone who works with something related with language will be, of course, interested. In my case, it's literature. We always think about that. So you start to work with linguistics and with the idea to study many languages, which is something special that because it's not something that linguistic will always do. No,
Right.
So the first things we wanted to ask you is how you start and how you start with linguistics first, and then to speak about learning many languages, etc. You are what we call polyglot, but there is a name for you have certified polyglot. No, hyper polyglot.
It's
People who speak more than 7 languages.
6 languages, yeah.
6 languages. Okay. You're hyper polyglot.
Yes, yeah.
That's okay.
It's kind of an embarrassing
Yeah,
term,
yeah.
but-
Hyper polyglot. Okay. So how you started with this career?
Right. So I guess the very beginning was actually because I started learning Spanish. My father's from El Salvador, but we only spoke English at home. And I grew up in the US, and you don't really start studying languages in the US until about high school. So it wasn't until high school that I realized that I was actually really bad at learning languages.
Okay.
So that's, I guess, the beginning was I started to get really interested in the topic because I had so many friends that spoke the languages of their parents, that spoke Cantonese, spoke Mandarin, spoke Spanish. But for some reason I didn't. And like, so I hadn't picked it up naturally from my parents. And then I got to high school. And then even when I was presented with textbooks and a teacher, I really struggled still to learn Spanish. So then I was like, well, why can't I learn Spanish? All these other people can do it. Why can't I? I was already kind of thinking like, how does language work? Like, why can't I language? And then when I got to university, actually it was a complete accident. My roommate wanted to go to a linguistics class and she was scared to go by herself. So she asked me to go with her. And I didn't even know what linguistics was. But I went there and I sat with her in the class and I realized, oh my God, there's a whole field of study devoted to figuring out how language works. And like, this is my chance to finally figure out why I can't speak Spanish. And the class was really fascinating. So for people that aren't familiar with linguistics, Linguistics is basically the study of language, and it can be the study of how language works in the brain. It can be the study of where language came from, like how it evolved, where it first came from. It can be the study of how it works in society, why certain people speak differently than other people. So there are a lot of different ways that you can study linguistics. I ended up focusing on psycholinguistics, which is how it works in the brain. And my specialization was on both language evolution, so where language came from in the first place, and then how we acquire it, mostly as adults. So I ended up focusing on that. And yeah, I guess
So
that's
you go for English, then you study Spanish,
yeah, so
and then how the other languages come up.
Yeah, so they all kind of overlap a little bit, but I started with Spanish in high school. Started doing French at the end of high school, just because I thought it would be interesting, although I still didn't really speak Spanish either at that point. Then started Mandarin and Russian in college, although I've now forgotten most of my Russian. I did some Arabic, forgot that one as well, because people here probably know that language learning is not really linear, and you forget as much as you learn. So then after that, moved to Korea, started studying Korean. Then and did American Sign Language. I worked in a research lab that studied Nicaraguan Sign Language, so actually learned some Nicaraguan Sign Language, then American Sign Language. Then in Korea studied Korean, and then took a break to study Indonesian. And those are my main languages that I speak. And then after that, I got really into dabbling, which is something we can talk about more later, but like learning just a little bit of lots of different languages. This is something that I'm really passionate about. So I spent a whole year, I think it was 2019. I was doing a lot of traveling for work. And I think it ended up going to about 14 or 15 countries and tried to learn a little bit of each of the languages that I went to. So of course, I crammed a little bit right before I went, and easy come, easy go. You forget it as fast as you learned it. So, but I still believe that there was a lot of benefit in that. And that's something that I can talk more about later too.
Yes, that is also something that I was not thinking to ask you, but now I need your advice. No, because you managed to learn good Chinese. And it's something for me has been so difficult. I learned all other languages before. English, very bad, as you can see, but I learned French, Italian, like this. But English, Chinese I am here now for 9 years, and still my level of Chinese is not so good. It's not, I cannot have a good conversation. I have now I have 2 hours of Chinese, 4 hours a week of Chinese. My teacher put PPT of vocabulary, and repeat for me is suffering. So what is your advice to learn Chinese for the people who come from Spanish or English or other languages?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I always like to say, I think is really important, is to, don't feel bad, because the American, the Foreign Service Department, or the Foreign Service Department has classified Chinese as one of the hardest languages to learn for English and Spanish speakers. They classify it as a language that takes 2,200 hours to learn. So 2,200 hours to learn, which doesn't sound like that much, but then if you actually do the math, if you're studying for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, which is not super easy on top of a job or a family, that's actually quite a lot. It'll still take you 8 years to learn Chinese. So the most important thing, first of all, is to not get discouraged. I think it really took me about 8 years to learn Chinese. And I was lucky that I started in college and I was doing it very intensively. But most people come to China with jobs, with families. They have a lot else going on in their lives, right? So the first thing is recognize that it's a huge task and don't feel bad for how long it's taking. And then I guess, there's a lot of things that I can recommend for studying Chinese. One of the most important things that helped me was learning to not be too analytical about it. So in the US, and I think to some extent in Spain, we really like to learn in a very analytical way. We like to learn grammar rules, and then we write out the sentences, and we make new sentences, and then we're trained to think that when we're going to speak Chinese, we're going to be like, okay, what's the subject, what's the object, and what's the grammar pattern that I learned for this? And if you try to speak a language like that, it takes way too long for your brain to figure out everything out that it needs to know. So for Chinese, I think it's really helpful to do what I call chunking. Just memorize sentences, or even better, memorize monologues. Memorize how you're going to present yourself, how you're going to introduce yourself. It depends on if you're working in literature. Memorize a monologue talking about your favorite book. or memorize a monologue talking about why you think this author is interesting compared to that author. So memorize chunks of language that are actually about what you're going to use. So I think one of the biggest problems that I see here in China when people are studying Chinese is they're taking these classes where they'll spend an hour talking about shopping in a grocery store, like how many people are actually going to grocery stores now? I mean, I do all my shopping on Meituan, right? So when I got to China, I sat down with my tutor and I said, show me how to order stuff on Meituan, like show me how to use Taobao.
Yeah.
And we actually learned, how to look up my orders, what have they done? Like we looked up like how to message with the Kuaidi guy if he can't find you. Like this is the stuff that I actually need in China. And then because I'm actually using it, it's getting reinforced. And so I'm actually remembering, and I'm not remembering vocabulary that's not related to what I actually need. I'm remembering that vocabulary. So those are my main.
Yes. It's interesting because, for example, in my case, sometimes I know the vocabulary for some things, like, for example, publishing house, things like that, because we work with that.
Right.
But then I want to ask the Didi to change the address or something, and he does. It's difficult. And what do you think about the apps to learn languages? For example, Duolingo, Yachon is learning Spanish, and then I see the sentences. El caballo come pasto. For example, when you will go to say that, no? But I guess repeating. What do you think about these apps, like Duolingo, and there is other many like that?
I think so. Duolingo definitely has a lot of value, but you can't rely on it alone to learn the language. I think the main value is that it gamifies the process of learning and it keeps you motivated. It reminds you every day that you need to work on it. But when you're learning, like the dog eats pasta or the horse eats pasta, like I really think that those sentences are chosen more for the marketing value of the app. Because they know if they have a really silly sentence, you're going to post it on Instagram. You're going to say, hey, what a silly sentence, for Duolingo. And then other people are going to be like, oh, what's Duolingo? And they're going to come and use it. But it's not actually necessarily curated for you to get better at language learning, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. I think the tools that I have found the most useful have been a platform called italki, which is a platform to find tutors.
Yeah.
And it's useful because it's
real people, right?
They're real people.
Yeah.
You just go on Zoom to meet with them, or you go on italki platform or any of the WeChat. But it helps with the platform helps with the accountability. It helps you set the schedule, you review your teachers. So it's just a whole comprehensive platform. And then you can have your teachers give you a lesson plan that's based on what you actually need to know. So like how to talk about literature or how to talk to DD drivers or fighting drivers, basically. So that's, I think, one of the most important things for Chinese. Then there's another tool that I really like for tonal languages like Chinese. It's called Glossika. So that's Glossika. And that's a tool that's really good for working on pronunciation. So basically this tool just gives you sentences and you repeat the sentences over and over and over. It's sort of like doing weightlifting reps for your tongue. It's incredibly boring. It's really, really painful, but it's actually really, really effective. So that's something that I think is also really
good. I will say. And you're writing a book about learning language, a little bit of each, let's say. I saw the extract of the books you're working on, and was the example of Turkish, where you have to, and I think is the same in Mongolia, I don't know, that you conjugate the verb or decline the verb different according of how real is the sentence.
Exactly.
I guess a little bit like the subjuntivo in Spanish.
Yeah.
And then you explain how important it is to learn language, even if it's a little bit of each. So I wanted to ask you if you have other examples, because it's always fun. And then how that helped why it's good to learn a little bit of Turkish, a little bit. And then if you can speak about the book itself that you're working.
So it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, dabbling in languages. And that's because when you learn a different language, languages all categorize the world in totally different ways, right? So languages pay attention to different things. So in Spanish, existence, so like to be or not to be, ser and estar, two very different ways to say to be. One is for a permanent state, one is for a transient state. As an English speaker, I really struggle with ser and estar because I'm not used to caring whether to be is permanent or transient. So when I learn Spanish and when I'm speaking Spanish, I always have to be doing a little bit of extra work, paying attention to the transience of this existence, right? So every time you learn some new categorization like that, your brain is working a little bit harder. It's a workout for your brain. So it's really good for getting better at the language, but it's also working out. We've learned, psycholinguists have learned, it also works out non-linguistic parts of your brain. It helps do things like delay Alzheimer's. It helps provide you with more what they call cognitive reserve, which means just when you're tired and you're starting to burn out, it gives you just a little bit more energy that you can pull from to do these tasks. So languages all have these different grammatical instructions. You mentioned the truth value in Mongolian and Korean. That's one of my favorite examples. So in Korean, for example, if you want to say it's raining, you have to conjugate the verb according to whether you saw that with your own eyes, or if someone told you, but you're not sure that it's true. So you're paying attention to this truth value. So you just, as you learn these different languages, you don't even have to become fluent, but as you're learning like a little bit of this new grammar pattern, you're training your brain to pay attention to different things in the world that it wasn't paying attention to before. So that's, I think, a really cool benefit of dabbling.
Yes. I remember what you say, ser y estar. Yeah, in Spanish, we take it like for granted, but when you see and you have to explain to French people or to English is difficult. Yeah. But for example, in China, it's a little bit more difficult, more easier, because estar can be side, like just start to be in a place, to be located in a place, right? And the other, like, yeah. So yeah, I guess also when you learn a language, it depends on which, and
so Chinese has some interesting examples from Chinese would be Chinese has measure words, right? So if you want
that's for example for me.
You literally classify every noun according to something that's important to Chinese. So whether it's a person, whether it's flat, whether it's a long skinny object, whether it's a bottle. In different languages, not every language has measure words, but a lot of languages do. One of my favorite ones is in Nicaraguan sign language. So the sign language that's used in Nicaragua, they have a classifier that's for unstable people. Huh? So that includes drunks, it includes people with some kind of disability, it includes babies, because they're babies when they're walking, they're unstable. So a regular person in Nicaraguan sign language, a regular person will walk, and this will be the classifier that's used for a regular person, but an unstable person will walk like this. It's a totally different classifier that's used. So as you're saying, the person walked down the street, you have to pay extra attention. Was this person stable or unstable? So that's just another good example.
Yes. And that is a bit related what I was going to ask you next, which is the big problem now we are speaking, for example, with this to make the language more inclusive, right? Like, for example, in Spanish to have the right? Some days ago, I don't know why really, I asked in a group which is called Teacher of Spanish in Beijing, if they teach with the and was such a problem because everyone was fighting, and most of them they were against. They were very angry with the idea. Well, in Spanish, you all know we have O will be more masculine and A will be more feminine, but they say O is not masculine or feminine, it's just. So we are trying to use one letter to don't make it
just not specify the gender.
Not the gender, So the academy, they say, the real academy, say it's not a gender, or is. So we say no? For example, todes, instead to say todas or todos, right? And there is such a reaction against that. And for example, one of the ideas was like, that is politic, etc., right? So the question is how important is to change the language, because they say, other guys say, if you change the language, but we continue in the same, for example, in Latin America, having a lot of femicidios, killing women, what is the meaning of changing the language? If that has any value, what is your point of view on that? In English, we are also thinking on that. In Chinese, I don't know if that is.
There's a little bit of that in China as well, with the use of ta, which is the third person, right? They actually have a very useful, and when you write ta, or when you say ta, actually, you can't tell if it's a female or a male, right? But when you write it, you do have to specify if it's female or male. But going back to the Spanish situation, my first instinct is always to say I'm not going to get involved, because linguists we learn or at least in the the branch of linguistics that I learned, we're told not to be prescriptivists.
Mm.
So we're supposed to sit back and observe language as it changes, and we're not supposed to tell people this is how language should happen. And generally, I think that comes from an understanding that if you study language long enough, you realize that you actually really can't really change language. It's going to keep on changing on its own, and there's not much that you can do.
You cannot change, but also you cannot not change. What I mean is,
Right,
it
yeah.
will change
It will
anyway.
change, exactly. But you're not going to have very much impact on it. In terms of actual usage, I would say, I mean, the purpose of language, one of the purposes of language, other than communication, is to signal to other people, I'm in your group, I'm in your peer group, right? So if you need to use a certain grammatical construction to signal to people, I'm part of a group that cares about inclusive language, then that's what you should use. And if you're not part of that group, then you shouldn't use it. But for the people that say, oh, that's not pure Spanish, like this is not like how Spanish was meant to be, well, like Spanish is literally vulgar Latin. Like Spanish is literally bad Latin, right? So language is going to keep on changing. You're not going to be able to affect that, really. But you should be using whatever language is going to help signal to other people that you're part of their group.
Yeah, that was another of the arguments. They say always has been like that. They say it was always, let's speak in Latin, because it's not always. Right? Yeah. And the other thing is, if something happened when you change the language, right? Because there were a moment in the 60s, for example, in French, when they say everything is the language. There is not outside of the language, because we think in language. So we cannot, but then now the neurology they say is not true. For example, if we see a flower, we don't think in flower, the word flower. We see colors, we smell, we have other kind of things coming before the language, right? So the language is important to learn not something, but it's not the most important. But for example, for you, what do you think when we change language, when we add languages or our vocabulary, or have a instead of o or a, you think that will have an impact in the society, like will change, we will be more inclusive, or will be just a letter? What do you
I think
think?
it will have an impact. Like I think that people are right to say it's not going to solve the problem just by saying a certain thing a certain way. It won't necessarily solve the problem. But I think a lot of researchers have shown that the way that you speak and the way that the language that you speak really does change your brain in a lot of ways, and it changes the way that you perceive the world. So yeah, I think it does have an effect. One thing that when I was studying Nicaraguan Sign Language, one of the cool things that we studied was we studied people that didn't have any language, because a lot of people in Nicaragua, if they weren't sent to a school for the deaf, they never learned sign language. So they literally grew up without any language at all. They would use gestures to communicate with their parents, but it wasn't a standardized language that we would be able to use. So they couldn't express really complex concepts. And then we would do research, psycholinguistic research, to see how they understand numbers, how they understand like spatial relations, all kinds of different cognitive tasks. And I think it's pretty clear from the research that's out there that you don't need language in order to think, right? Like you can still have feelings, you can still be hungry, you can still have pretty complex
We don't
thoughts.
think in language.
We don't think,
we don't? Yeah.
We don't necessarily think in language, necessarily, but it does. But once you do have a language, it's really hard to not think in it. So it's still going to affect the way that you think, and it's still going to affect the way that you categorize the world, exactly for the reasons that I was talking about before, because you're paying attention to certain things so that you can say a grammatical sentence, right? So it can't not affect the way that you think.
Yeah. Once we spoke about this language, this word they have in Japanese. You will remember, and I don't.
Orebi.
Is that I
don't speak Japanese, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Ige taught me this great word.
No, because it's the sun coming through the tree. And we were saying, for example, Kurosawa has many shots where you see the light coming, right? And probably because he think in Japanese, he could see it, right?
Yeah.
So probably when you have the word, you can see more nuances or more different things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the other question is a big topic now, like how much we will use the technology. For example, how much you use the technology to study linguistics, how much that will change the use of the big data, etc., to study languages. And also one other thing is, if you think that can help to protect some languages? Because I saw there is some languages in danger always, but not only minor language, like say Quechua, there is less people speaking. Well, Quechua is not so small, but we have, for example, in the south of Argentina, there is a language speak for 200 people, and it's like, but for example, Belarusia, I read that it's like something like 5 million or something, and it's a big language, but because everyone speaks Russian, Belarusian is going to yeah. So I don't know, maybe if we record in a way. So how we use technology in linguistics?
Yeah, actually, so I'm a lot more optimistic about the preservation of minority languages now, actually, than I was even just a few years ago. And that's because I think what we've started to see in the last 2 years is that these models that we're using for linguistic AI, they used to need a lot of data. So actually my company, one of our main services that we provide is collecting and annotating data to train models like ChatGPT. And at the very beginning, when we started in this, you needed a ton of data. This is why it was lucrative for us to be in this business. You need a ton of data to train a model. So if you want to build a speech recognition engine that recognizes Hakka, you need to get a lot of Hakka data, and then you need a lot of Hakka speakers to help annotate that data. That's extremely expensive to create.
How you get this data?
You send people out to the field with a microphone. Or during COVID, you send them messages to their phone and say, hey, can you record this word for us? So in the beginning, it was really just languages like Spanish, German, Japanese. If you wanted to use Siri, you want to use Alexa, they didn't have that many languages that you could use it in. Now, as the models get better and better, and people have seen how good ChatGPT is, it's really, really good. You actually need less and less data to train the model. So it's getting to be scarily good. So in some cases, you only need maybe 100 instances, 200 instances of some kind of data to train a model like that. So now it's actually possible, and it's actually affordable to make a model that will understand Hakka, or that will understand Swiss German, or that will understand Belarusian. So actually, I think it's a really interesting, people were really assuming, I think the number that they were saying was that we were going to lose half of the world's languages by the year 2050. That's just the number that they've been throwing around for the last 20 years. But I think they're going to have to revise that estimate, because especially in countries like China and in India, a lot of consumers are starting to expect to be able to use their language if they want to buy something online. If they want to purchase a product, they no longer want to have to deal with English or even have to deal with Mandarin. They want to buy it in Bengali. They want to buy it in Hokkien. And people that are selling services and products are realizing I can get a lot more buyers if I do translate this, or if I do have an AI that works in their languages. And now that it's so cheap, I think more people are going to be doing that. And so that will help perpetuate the minority languages. So
what do you think about, because you say ChatGPT is good, and I saw in Twitter you use it a bit, like you put some posts that I didn't have a good experience, but I use it like no, I don't know, like I wanted to see if he's able to write something, short story or something, or poem, but I didn't find nothing good. But how you use it and why you found it good?
Yeah, so I like to say it functions at about the level of like a drunk undergraduate student.
Yes,
like
so what is good on that, you know?
I still hire drunk undergraduates.
Okay.
They can help you to do a lot of the initial grunt work, and then you still have to check the work. Because you don't know if they're reliable, but it can still help you do a lot of the initial work. So for example, for the book that I'm working on, I'm often trying to find, what's a really interesting example of this grammatical construction, or what did the Thai use for this grammatical construction? So I'll generally just ask ChatGPT, can you give me a really interesting example of a measure word in an Austronesian language? And then they'll give me a bunch of examples, and then I'll have to go actually check. And half of them will be complete lies, but some of them will be useful.
Why it's like because they found an internet, or
because I think the model's actually a little bit too good at kind of predicting what might be an answer that you like. But that answer that you like is not necessarily the accurate answer. And actually, you can actually say, is this accurate? And I do this all the time. I'll say, was this actually accurate? Are you able to provide me with a source for this? And then sometimes it will say, I'm sorry, I'm a large language model, and this might not be completely accurate. So, it just helps you with the first step, but you do still have to check it.
And also adapt. For example, your chat is not the same as mine.
Yeah, it's constantly training. So as I provide it with more feedback, as I tell them this isn't actually what I was looking for, it does start to get better and better. So researching for the book, sometimes for drafting, although I think as you've shown, as you've seen, it's still functioning at maybe it's more like elementary school student for writing poetry and writing.
For example, for the short stories or things like that, the same with the image. When you put after was also on the pandemic, so I try a lot with image, right? Like after a moment, you start to see it's all the same. You can recognize the style, and with writing is the same. After a moment, and I couldn't. If my idea was to take one and put it in my book and say I wrote it, no, because you can see very easy that it's written, and also has no intention. It's really like plain, not yeah. But I was going to ask you about your company, because that one of the first questions I forgot. Can you tell us about your company?
Yeah, sure. So the company is called Meridian Linguistics. It started as a translation company. I started out as a freelance translator. And then a few years ago, we started getting more requests for data for AI. Because we basically, as a translation company, we have a database of a lot of people that speak different languages. So people came to us saying, hey, we need to build a Cantonese text-to-speech engine. Do you have Cantonese speakers that know anything about phonology? So we started providing that. I didn't know anything about AI when that first started, so I started just kind of teaching myself what they might need. And then we ended up pivoting into that field, and it's been really gratifying, especially now with ChatGPT. Now I actually can see where that comes from, and I understand the momentousness of what's happening.
So you hire people to put the data.
Yeah, so they might collect the data. So for example, one project that we did was we helped to train a Swedish robot dog. So a robot dog that was going to play with Swedish children. So people always ask, they say, oh, well, don't these models already exist? Why do you need to train, multiple, why do companies need more data and more data? Well, so for this robot dog, it needed to understand Swedish children. Swedish children speak differently from Swedish adults, right? So they needed us to collect sentences that would be most likely spoken by a Swedish child. It needs to be in their pitch, so it's a little bit higher pitch than an adult. And they would need to be saying things that they would normally say to a dog, because they wanted the dog to understand, sit and like fetch and stuff like that. So it was a very rushed project. So we were working with Swedes all over the world, kind of helping them train them on how to collect data from children, which is also just extremely difficult. If you've ever worked with kids in like a research setting, you can only do about 10 minutes at a time. Then you take a long break and then you do another 10. And then after we collected all those sound bites from the children, we needed to annotate it so that we could help train the engine, and the engine would know what these words were and what this data was. So it's really fun for linguists. So if you've done like a degree in linguistics, it's not that often that you actually get to use what you learned in like a professional setting or in a like marketable setting. So it's fun for the linguist to get to work with Swedish and annotate the data. And at the end of the day, we have a robot dog that now understands Swedish children and can play with Swedish children. And it's data that's customized for that.
And you work with how many languages?
Pretty much all the big ones. So we have a database of, I think we're at about 7,000 linguists in our database now. So they're all freelancers. I guess most of the work will be in about 50 languages. These are the languages that are really marketable right now and are making the most money. But every once in a while we'll get a really cool request for a language that we didn't even know existed, like Jonka, like all kinds of really interesting languages that will get asked for, and then we'll have to go quickly Google and figure out what it is.
And how you imagine the future? For example, will be a moment probably soon that won't be necessary to learn languages, right? Because we will have the phone, we can translate to all the languages.
Yeah,
you think we will still be valued to learn languages?
I think it'll still be valuable for the reasons that I was mentioning before about how it changes your brain. So if you're using Google Translate, you're never going to get the cognitive benefits of having learned it. And then I think everyone here probably, we're in China, so you probably had the experience of consuming information in a language that's not your native language, or that's not a language that you're very comfortable in. And the more comfortable you get with a language, the more viscerally you're going to feel the information that you're consuming. So especially if you're consuming creative stuff like poetry or literature, if you just translate that, you're not going to get the feeling that you get from reading a poem in a language that you understand, right? So you might get the message, but you're not going to get the feeling. So I think that there's still a lot of value, but I'm also really excited about how technology is going to change language learning because I think it's going to make it a lot easier. So hopefully it won't be 8 years to learn Chinese, right? Hopefully it'll just be 1 year, 2 years.
How you can think can be easier? Which tools, for example, you imagine can provide to make it a bit easier?
So I guess I imagine a world in which I can tell ChatGPT, I want to learn Mandarin. I'm, a person in my 30s living in China, and I work in the field of AI. I'm interested in poetry. I'm interested in hip hop dance. So these are the kind of realms that I'm going to be using. Can you help design me a language plan to get me to Chinese in 2 years? How many hours a week should I be studying? What resources should I be using? Can you maybe even write me a textbook that's just for me? Like Sarah Maria's Chinese plan. And then tell me what I should do, basically, like a personal trainer for language.
Yeah.
I don't think we're that far off from having an engine that can do that.
Yes. I have a friend who is working, is part of a big team that they are working in something that will do movies like that. Like you will put the profile and everything, and they will provide movies for you in some years. But that is kind of dangerous as well, because if you watch your movie, read your book only for you, we will become like so specific each of us, right? The good part is that we can share something. We probably saw the same movies and something, but probably to learn the language is a good idea.
Yeah, right? You're right. It almost, in the creative realm, I guess we're in danger of losing some serendipity, right? Because if we're always given exactly what we want, we'll never stumble across new things.
Yeah, that is what do like Amazon, that give you the books, like you will always expect the algorithm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the good is when you choose a surprise, when you find a book in a hotel and say, oh, what is this book? And you read it and you was not in the plan, right?
Right.
That is what the algorithm will, yeah.
That's why bookstores are still really useful, right? Because you can kind of wander around.
Yes, because you can wander, and also in a way somebody else can propose something that will be some way for you, but not based on in what you have done. Yeah, and what do you think in the idea of language, of the idea of the common languages? For example, Esperanto was something like that. Then they say, oh, we can all learn English and speak in English, and then as a linguistic, what do you think to have a common language now that we like a globalization, like for everyone speaking the same language?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible, because for the same reasons that we were talking about how languages change the way you think, and the way that you think changes language, it goes both ways. So for as long as we have very different cultures all over the world, we're going to care about different things. We don't all care about the same things. So we're not going to name every single concept the same way, because we care about different things, right? So people are I was very surprised when I learned that there are many sign languages in the world, that there's not just one sign language, right? But American Sign Language users don't care about the same things that Japanese Sign Language users care about, right? And American Sign Language users don't even care about the same things that English speakers care about. They're living in a very different world, right? So the grammar of American Sign Language is actually very different from the grammar of English. And that's because this language has evolved to cater to the needs of someone who's deaf, who's living in a world that doesn't have sound. And that means that they're categorizing visual things in a very different way than English speakers would, for example. So I don't think it'll ever be possible, even with technology, nor do we really want to have one language, because then you'd just be forcing one way of thinking upon people that are having this really beautiful, diverse way of viewing the world, right? So, I mean, even with so much access through the internet, even with so much American influence, which is waning already, but the influence of American media on the rest of the world, we still have not gotten anywhere close to having English truly be a lingua franca. So I don't think it's something that we have to worry about.
Yeah. I also don't think. Also because when everyone speaks English, many of us, for example, are not in the fully capacity. In Spanish, I'm very smart. No, but I mean, we are not in the whole. Yeah. But for example, the last question I wanted to do, when you're writing a novel as well, Okay, I think, if you can tell us about that, and also how you write when you are linguistic, because I guess you are more aware of the language itself, or something.
Yeah. Well, I won't talk too much about the novel.
Yeah.
It's just a project that I'm working on.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, it's fine. It's something that I'm finding really gratifying. It's just a really fun, creative project that I'm working on. But yeah, I think being a linguist for sure informs the way that you're thinking about language a lot of the time. I really like that since I've learned a lot of different languages, I've learned to pay attention to other things in the world that I can then put in the novel. I mean, I think when we read creative works, we're reading it because we want to be told something new, right? Or we want to notice something new, or we want someone to describe something that we've already seen before, but we want it to be described in a really new and interesting way, right? So when you learn a lot of different languages, you learn to pay attention to those different things, and it helps kind of train your brain to be able to describe them in new ways. So yeah, it's been really, I never did anything creative before really, and it's been kind of fun to see how I can use the linguistic experience to sort of inform that. But it's still something that, I mean, it's just a hobby, and it's
I
still have
did,
zero talent in
yeah.
it, but it's really fun. Just it's a fun process.
Yes. I don't know if it was, but I think it was Nabokov, like he said, in literature you try to see the language, to make the language visible, because in other you just use the language as a tool, but in literature you try to see the language, make it more like always like a material. Yeah. So maybe for you it's easier or something.
Maybe, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Do you have some question? Somebody want to ask something? Sí.
Sorry,
Uh-huh.
late, so I might come back to the phone for you and sort of. Well, it was interesting to me when you said that one of the ways that we might be able to learn languages faster is by having sort of like a personal trainer. Because I guess in my experience, I've never really had like a one-on-one lesson with a teacher. And I don't really, I guess, let me just be a bit of a devil's advocate and be, in my experience, it's been hard to learn a language, no matter what kind of courses I've been taking. And I was wondering, like, do you really think that, or do you think that like having lessons where, you are learning things that are particularly interesting to you would help our brains develop this information faster? Or would it be like sort of learning at the same pace, but then we'd be using the words that we'd be using more often? I don't know if that makes sense to you. Like, is it you would have a more thorough understanding of the language at a faster pace, or would we have sort of like the information that we need for the conversations that we might likely use? So that's my first question. And my second question is, I'm curious to know, like, with your exposure to different languages, what's been your favorite word or phrase?
Oh, it's really difficult. Okay, let's see if I can do the first one. Yeah, so I think something that you may be alluding to, maybe, is that I think really one of the best ways to learn language is really just get kind of thrown into it. So I'm assuming that the way that you learned your many languages has kind of just been to be thrown into an environment where you're using it and speaking it, right? But one thing that I think is always important to note is that, like I like to say, language is not just a single exe file that you can download and then you suddenly like can do everything in Spanish. You can do everything in French. Language is made up of all these different skills that are not necessarily transferable. So if I study, if I read a lot of Spanish literature in school, which is what happened to me in high school, I still couldn't speak a word when I got to Spain. I couldn't ask people where the metro was. I could write an essay about Garcia Marquez, but I felt really, really embarrassed to say anything in a bar, So you actually have to practice what you're good at. So you'll notice, especially immigrants in different countries that get thrown into a situation where they have to sell their products in a new language, they learn the language really, really fast, like way faster than someone that maybe goes to classes, would ever learn it, right? But that's because they're practicing speaking every day. Now they might have more trouble reading a novel in that language. So they might actually need to work with a teacher to learn how to read a novel in that language. So yeah, at the end of the day, the best way to do it is to just throw yourself at whatever skill you want to learn. So if you want to speak, you really just start speaking. If you have a teacher to help you with that, that's great. But the most important thing is that you just speak as much as you possibly can. But then you have to recognize that's not necessarily going to help you learn to read. And in China, it's really the case, right? Where learning to speak Chinese is totally different from learning to read a Chinese newspaper. So I think as adults, most of us are pretty scared to be thrown into a situation where you're really just speaking from day one. And so that's one reason why teachers can help kind of be a crutch for that. But you're right to point out that sometimes that'll slow you down. It might not get you, the most experience. I don't know if that answers your first question. As for the second question, my favorite word or phrase. I should really have something good prepared for this because there's so many different. I really love learning the word komorebi, which was the light coming through the trees. I think I've been spending a lot of time in hutongs lately, and it's just so beautiful the way that the light comes through the willow trees that are kind of swaying, and you can see the shadows moving on the ground, and such a beautiful word. Other than that, I really like the word in Spanish, comisura, which is the corner of your mouth, like this part of your mouth. In English, we don't have a word for that. I think it's really beautiful. It sounds really beautiful as well.
Yeah.
And it's very romantic. I should, this is a really good question. I should definitely come up with better examples. I'll think about it.
There is a book of untranslatable books, language that words that we cannot translate. And from Spanish, they have also sobremesa. Yeah, it's also that. That is, sobremesa is the word, the conversation we have after eating, after lunch. It's more for lunch, I guess. I think it's not for dinner, but I'm not sure. It's sobremesa solo for lunch, right? También for dinner, yes. It's the conversation you have after it, Yes. This word is only in Spanish, sobremesa.
And if we had that in English, then probably the waiter wouldn't come with a check so early in the US. With a check right away. They're not expecting sobremesa. We don't really have sobremesa.
But you eat and you go, and no sticky.
Sobremesa is not a conversation. For us, it's like a drink.
It's like a drink. In Argentina is the conversation. I think in Spain the conversation you have after the lunch. That is from Colombia, right? Is the drink after lunch?
With the lunch.
With the lunch. Sobremesa. Yes. There is any other question? Somebody want to ask? Okay. Hello.
My question is how to keep the motivation about learning language. Because my experience, I feel like when I was in school and we have no routine to attend class every day, and so it helps you a lot at learning. And like your job requires you to speak the language, and it motivates you a lot. But besides that, like for example, I want to learn German because I want to go to Germany in the future. But how can I motivate myself to be learning active? This the work and without easy and come home without wasting it. That's my question.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think I have a few recommendations. And the first one for me, I learned this metaphor from the book Atomic Habits, which I don't know if you guys have read. I really recommend it. But the author of this book, who writes about how to build skills out of small habits that you add into your lifestyle, he mentioned that there are certain skills that function sort of like the way that an ice cube melts. So if you have an ice cube and then you put it in a room that's slowly getting warmer and warmer, for a long time, you're not going to see any difference. You're going to see an ice cube, it doesn't look like it's changing. And then you get to a certain point, a certain temperature, and then finally you start to see a little bit of melting of that ice cube. But you had to get from, if you're going from, I guess, -10 to -9, -8 to -7, the ice cube is still frozen, you don't see any difference. Then you finally get to 0 and then 1, and then you start to see a little bit of melting. So I think when you're learning a language, a lot of it is that initial, you're learning stuff, but you're not actually seeing any return on your investment yet. So you're wondering if you're even doing it right, you're getting really discouraged, you still can't speak Spanish, so you don't know why you're doing it. But then one day, you actually do something right. You have a conversation with your hairstylist and it actually works. And then, okay, maybe this is right. And then maybe you go another 5 years without really feeling another moment like that. But so the most important thing is to keep on going, even if you don't feel like you have noticeable results yet. Don't give up too early, because then you'll never get to that point. And then after that, I think one thing that it took me a long time to learn is that you need to have a real concrete goal. So my goal initially was learn Spanish. What does that mean? Like, you know, I didn't realize that learn Spanish meant like I need to learn to speak in Spanish about myself. I need to be able to talk about AI in Spanish. I need to be able to read Spanish newspapers. And these are all very different skills. So a much better goal is plan a trip to Germany. And then when I get to Germany, I need to be able to order food, talk to people about myself. So like literally book that ticket and then work backwards from when your flight is going to be and think, okay, how many words do I need to know by the time I go to Germany? Okay, how am I going to learn those 300 words? You know, okay, I'm going to do 5 words per day until that. So if you can set a specific date by which you expect to have accomplished a very concrete thing, then you can work back to the actual date that you're at and figure out, what do I need to do every week to get there? Then it's actually really gratifying too, because you check off every week, you can see your noticeable progress. Even if you can't speak German yet, you learned 50 words that week. So you have a sense of gratification that pulls you forward. That helps.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
When I read the announcement about the talk with linguistic and language, I saw, wow, that's very important. And when I started studying English a few years ago, at the beginning it was very hard for me. Oh no, I can't do it. I want to speak fluent, never. And when I started thinking about the process with the language, and we never stop learning. So that's interesting. And one thing that the talk made me think about is I always think that I have 3 boxes in my mind when I study English. In one box is when the words that I know the meaning and the significante.
Yeah, the meaning.
The meanings is significado, and significante is signified. Well, it's the word that I can use very well. And the second one is maybe that kind of word that sometimes I hear, but I don't really know the meaning. And the third one is all the rest of the word that I don't have idea. It's very nice or it's very important to link this word, the linguistic and language, and to motivate this process.
Yeah, that's great.
This question is more about into the step. Because just hearing a little bit about the AI, how this is get all this data to put this robots and everything. What do you think is gonna happen with the figurative language? With the irony, where you know, all these linguistic games that we have in the discourse in terms of discourse language. What will happen?
I think it's going to continue to get richer, actually. So ChatGPT is a good example. It's learning humor really well. It's learning cynicism really well. It's really good at it's getting better at being poetic. It's still like 3rd grade poet, but it's getting better at it. I think another type of technology that people were really afraid of was texting. Well, first writing. People were afraid of writing first, and then texting. They worried that texting was going to ruin language. I think that there's a great book about this. I think that texting has actually added a whole new level of nuance to language. There's a lot of things that we used to only write in text that we're now using in everyday speech. So the book is called Because Internet. It's a book basically about the evolution of internet language and evolution of texting and how that's changed the way that we communicate. So I think that with technologies like this, we're going to be seeing more and more of those kinds of leaps, those kind of jumps, and those kinds of additions to our language. But I'm not worried really about it constraining us in any way. I think it's just going to add to that.
Yes, now we share things that before we didn't share. What I mean, like yesterday, a friend sent me a picture. I bought these shoes that we were talking about. And before we will never call somebody,
yeah,
and say,
yeah.
hey, hello, I'm calling you because I bought these shoes.
Here's a picture of my lunch.
Yeah, it's a picture of my lunch. We share that. It's good, but also I have a real problem with WhatsApp. I don't know WeChat. I don't know what to do. I mean, no, it's not a real problem, but I'm it's more a source of stress than happiness. So it's a new technology, but instead of making me happier. So yeah, after some hours I don't see the phone, you have many messages, and some are for work, some are important, some are the shoes that I have to reply something good. but yeah, but it's good that we share more things, but we are in the point like it's becoming a bit difficult to manage so many messages sometimes. And also I was thinking about ChatGPT. Like sometimes the things are important because who say it, right? It's like, this person says something is important for me, but if ChatGPT, you don't care in the end. So that's also changed the message, like who is saying.
And AI is getting better at that too, right? So here's just one example is Instagram. I don't know how much you use Instagram, but Instagram has created 3 different message boxes for me. It has the primary message box where I'll get my messages from Kezia. And then it has the general message box where people that I don't know send me messages. So maybe it's interesting to me, maybe it's not. And then it has another box that doesn't even show me blocked messages. It knows I'm not going to want to see these messages. They're generally pretty inappropriate messages or spam or trying to sell me Bitcoin or something like that. So the AI is already getting pretty good at helping me filter who I'm going to want to respond to so that I'm not overwhelmed with messages. I think we'll see more of that. Gmail already does that. I mean, we have spam filters in our email, right? But I think at some point, maybe our phones will get better at detecting, okay, WeChat, maybe it's important for you to see WeChat because you're living in China. So this might be related to your work. Maybe WhatsApp is a little less urgent. So it'll show you your messages in order of priority. So I think that will help with communication as well. So you're not overwhelmed.
Yes. I hope so. Yeah. Do you have any question? Yeah.
Just a small comment. No, I'm just thinking about maybe we can in future, maybe we can have our own kind of small personal chat GPT, and like we can teach that program how to answer all the boring messages. Like compose one
yes.
appropriate message and just like wow. Nice tune. But like my question is more about psychological side of how to deal with languages, because sometimes, and maybe we were like had the same questions by the same question before, like sometimes it's hard for me, like when I'm switching like from one language to another, sometimes I feel like really unconfident, like what's going on here, or some people like, oh, what if I say something wrong, like how to get through the barrier, and how to like, is there any psychological tricks or something like that which can maybe you can use something to feel yourself like more comfortable when you're trying to do your way and be active.
Yeah, I've talked about this with a lot of friends because I'm part of this really nerdy community of people that love to learn languages, right? And so we talk about this a lot. Some of my friends are really good at quickly switching between languages. I'm really bad at it. And I spent a year really working on this skill, like really trying to learn how to quickly switch. And I would set up a day with like several different language classes in a row so I could try to get better at switching between them. And I'm still really, really bad at it actually. But I was speaking to someone that was developing an app that was supposed to attack this particular problem. And he was saying that like the way that he thinks about it is that you just kind of have to prime yourself for the language that you're about to speak. So the advice that he gave me, which I've been using now, is just to do as much as you can as of like a refresher before you're going to be thrown into a situation where you speak another language. So like I'm living in China, I'm using Chinese most days. But before I go to lunch with you, I was like listening to some Spanish songs and like reading the newspaper in Spanish. Like, can I still Spanish today? And making sure that I was going to be ready to be able to chat in Spanish, even just like a little bit of putting yourself back into the language. In general, when I switch, I guess when I'm expecting that people might ask me to switch into another language, I'll kind of give myself a second. I'm like, if I'm going to switch into Korean, I have there's a Korean filler word that you'll use, kudong, and I'll kind of get myself into the, okay, kudong, give myself a second to like download the Korean file and then switch into that. Some people are really good at it naturally.
But the question is, it's expected to be natural, but it's like cannot be natural. It's hard.
It's hard. I think you just have to give yourself grace for that. You just have to accept that it's going to be hard. Like to change, like when you're speaking one language, you have all these syntax or all these neural networks that are working in that language, and then you're suddenly going to switch into another one and have completely new neural networks. That's hard. I grew up monolingual, so for me it's crazy hard. There are people that grew up bilingual and trilingual, I think, are a lot better at it, but I wish I had a better response for you. I think my best response is just like forgive yourself for not being good at it. It's hard.
I would say that babbling is one more of those strategies like translanguaging and code switching.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only problem is for me, I do a lot of dabbling, and that hasn't helped me to get better at switching between the languages like quickly. It's given me a lot of other benefits for sure, other cognitive benefits. In fact, one of the benefits that researchers have found is that it helps you with task switching. So just switching from like, if you're working on you're writing an article and then your editor calls and you have to do a call with your editor, and then you have to get back to your article and like, where were you? Like, what was your train of thought again? So that kind of task switching, you get better at that sort of thing the more languages that you learn. So that's some research that they've done recently. And there's lots of little non-linguistic stuff like that are improved by dabbling in languages.
And sometimes when you have the ignorance or talking to yourself, which instinct you choose for the language?
For talking to myself. So my mother tongue is English, so generally I'll almost always use English. If I've been in another country, like in Nicaragua, there were long periods of time when I would only speak Spanish. Then maybe I'd come close to using, or maybe I'd use words. Sometimes I do use words that are more efficient in certain languages than in, like the word mafan is so efficient, which means like troublesome or annoying in Chinese, right? In English, it doesn't. You kind of need more words to encompass that kind of concept. So I'll probably use mafan in my self-talk. So that's another cool thing about learning other languages. You learn words that encompass a certain concept more neatly and more efficiently than other languages might have done it. And whenever you can do that, whenever you can condense a big idea into one little word, it makes it easier for you to manipulate that concept in your mind and to add more thoughts onto that, right? So self-talk is, I haven't done too much of this, but my other friends that like to learn a lot of languages really recommend doing self-talk in your foreign languages as much as you can. So just kind of like talking to yourself in Chinese, if you're learning Chinese, or talking to yourself in Russian, just as like a way to get extra practice. I haven't tried it yet, much myself.
And you think you're a little bit different in each language? What I mean is, a friend once I was speaking, and she told me, I will never say this in Chinese. I say in English, I don't care because it's like, and you think there is things you say in one language you won't say in other, or your personality change a little bit when you speak in French or Spanish?
Yeah, for me, there's a really big difference, but for me, it's because my levels are so different, right? So, especially for Chinese, but even for Spanish, I'm so much more shy because I know my grammar's not perfect and my accent's not perfect. So I'm much more hesitant and I'm much more shy. And I feel like in English, I'm much more exuberant and more extroverted. So that just makes a huge difference on my personality. I have heard from people that are closer to bilingual that they do feel like there are certain concepts that they're more comfortable expressing just by nature of which words are in that language, right? Or which environments they learned that language in. So I think that makes sense. But for me, unfortunately, my level's not high enough in any of my languages since I learned them so late. My levels aren't high enough to really know if my personality has fundamentally changed. But I'd be interested. I mean, I bet a lot of people here have very strong levels in multiple languages, and maybe have an answer to that.
know, maybe like the hardest question is how to get rid of these shy parts.
Yeah,
Child part, you say when you change language?
No, like when you feel like I don't really feel confident enough
Ah.
to speak about complicated topics.
Ah.
Actually, it's a barrier which don't have to exist because when you're afraid of speaking, you're not going to improve like the real
Yeah.
thing. So what can you do?
Yeah.
I guess I almost always say that I'm like really talentless in learning languages and I'm really like, I don't feel like I have a talent for it, but maybe one advantage that I have is that I'm not a perfectionist. I'm like really, I just like to get stuff done and I don't care if it's perfect. I just want to get it done. So when I speak, I think in most situations, I'm a little less nervous about sounding bad than maybe I should be. But that means that I get more out, I get more practice done. And in general, I have seen, it seems to me like a lot of the people that are the best language learners are people that are not too worried about. Yeah. So you just kind of have to get used to feeling really embarrassed all the time.
Is there any study that are people, the studies that, is there people who are naturally born for learn languages and other that are less inclined to learn languages?
Yeah, so this is a topic I've just started researching, so I don't have any really good examples for you yet, but we're going to do a panel on this at a conference that I'm going to, because people want to discuss, they want to argue, is there such a thing as talent, as like an innate talent for learning languages? I'm going to argue the side that there's no such thing. I think that it's all exposure. I think that it's all practice. I think that people that seem talented at learning languages were actually exposed at a very young age to a lot of practice, to a lot of data. So I don't think that there's some kind of magical thing that shows up in some people and doesn't show up in others that allows them to be better or worse at these things. That's my take. But in maybe about 3 months, I can send more research over to you on the actual topic.
Yeah. I will add one advice my friend recently gave me because we were speaking about how to learn English, Chinese. Didn't help me yet, but my friend Pablo from Colombia, he's speaking Chinese very well. He's a translator. And I was saying, how can I do it? Because I'm a bit tired of taking classes and being in the same level. And he told me that language are not just a tool, something you learn, but it's something also kind of psychological. And you say, how about you sit and you think why you want to learn Chinese? Because you say, he told me, you express, tengo que aprender chino. And you say, why? I have to. You're feeling like already like obligation or something like that. So he told me, think a little bit, why you want to learn Chinese? What you want to learn in Chinese? And probably that will help me to have another relationship with the language. Yeah.
Yeah, so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming.
Yeah, or yes, something like that. And I remember once when I was living in France, I was teaching a kid Spanish. And her mother was Spanish and the father was French. And for some reason, he could speak Spanish only with me. And then when the mother come up, he started to speak in French. And I was telling, I am a good teacher, but he speak Spanish, and then he switched.
Yeah.
But I guess later when he continued, he was able to speak Spanish with the mother, but because he was, I think, I don't remember, but 9 years old, he always speak French with the mother. So, but I mean, it's also psychological effects or something like that. So, like this friend told me, try to find out what will be your relationship with this language, like why you want to learn, etc. Probably that's helped. I don't know if for the moment I didn't improve so much, but maybe later will.
Children are very pragmatic, right? They really don't want to speak a language with someone who isn't like using that language primarily. And that's why they recommend the one parent, one language method, which is where one parent speaks their native language, the other parent speaks their native language, but they don't mix them up. Because I mean, and the children are right. Like, why would you try to force a language on someone if you don't need it, right? So I think you're right that really applies to adults as well. For me, one reason I really wanted to speak Chinese is because I wanted to be able to read like WeChat, and I wanted to be able to read Weibo, and I wanted to see what Chinese people are talking about. So that's for me very motivating to learn how to use that language for that particular thing. But a lot of people will ask me, do you speak Chinese at home with your husband? Because John speaks really good Chinese as well. for us, that would be weird to speak Chinese at
Yeah,
home. It's not, our mother tongue is English, so it'd be really weird to speak Chinese at home. We could do it, I guess, practice, but it would be really bizarre. So yeah, you find what actually is going to make your life better. In my case, it was being able to read Weibo and see what people are talking about here. But like situations like speaking Chinese with my husband, obviously would be.
Yeah. I see. There any other question? Somebody?
How important is the mistake in the knowledge process? Because I remember when I was child, I studied in the institution, and I remember my teacher face when I had a mistake, grammar mistake or vocabulary mistake, and it was very punished about that. And I think that's attitude immediate in the process. And when I grew up and I understood that maybe the mistake could be included in the knowledge process. I don't know if you are
For sure. I mean, you're always going to have mistakes, and probably for the rest of your life, right? You're never going to be perfect. Even in English, I'm not perfect, and even in Spanish, I'm sure you make mistakes all the time, right? So you can't feel limited by that. I had a really good breakthrough on this when I have a French tutor that when I make mistakes, he'll type them in a Google Doc that I'm sharing with him. So he'll never stop me. He'll never be like, no, that was a mistake, and then stop my train of thought. He'll never stop me and punish me, but he'll just write it in a Google Doc. So as I'm talking, I can see what he's writing in the doc, and I can make a mental note. Oh yeah, I got to fix that for the next sentence. I'll fix that. But that way it doesn't slow me down and it doesn't stop me. I think also just in general, different people prefer different levels of being corrected. And the advice that I've gotten is tell your tutor right from the start, I want you to correct me every time, or don't correct me. Just let me talk. I'll figure it out eventually. I'm going to make mistakes. That's natural. Whatever makes you feel like you're progressing, but also like you're being motivated. Because for some people, being corrected all the time is really going to be demotivating, like you say. So I think it's a personal preference for everyone. It's a great point.
I have a question that's not related to yours, and actually your comments as well about school, and I don't know. So for me, learning Chinese, I associated when I was in high school and I had to take Chinese classes, and my teacher was really strict. And I made a lot of mistakes to the point where I think half of the people in my class felt like it was no use to try to learn this language because it was very difficult. And actually, like when I have taken separate Chinese courses where it's a much smaller class and everything like that, I found it a little easier to follow like the process and see myself improving. So I guess this is a more broad question as to whether it's actually important at all to learn these languages experience, or that we should just try to get, people to get into like individual courses for a particular language that they want to learn.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of language learning is very comparable to athleticism and sports. And I feel like learning languages in schools is a lot like PE or physical education that we have in the US. I'm not sure what they have in other countries, but often you'll have like a class that's really just for sports, right?
Yeah.
And you're not really going to get very good at any sports in that class. You're going to work your body out a little bit. Like it'll be good for some cardio, but you're not going to learn baseball. You're not going to learn like an actual sport. And I think it's the same in schools. I like that we have language learning in schools because it's a good introduction to the rest of the world. And it's telling kids these languages are important, so we're going to allocate an hour of the day to learning this language. But most schools in most countries are really inefficient at teaching languages, as you know. So the danger of it is people come out of it thinking, oh, I must just not be very good at it, right? Because I took 4 years of French and I still can't speak French. I must just not be very good at speaking French. So that's the real danger. But I don't think we should do away with it in schools. I think we just have to keep on pushing to improve the pedagogy. We know that in some countries, they've done a really good job at this. In Sweden, they have excellent English levels. So they've figured out how to teach English, right? So we just have to get better at implementing that in our countries so that we can encourage children more.
Yeah. Will you encourage, like they have many languages, like double, but in the school, like to learn a little bit of Russian, a little bit of,
To dabble in schools.
instead to have only one
That's
language.
actually a really
Mm.
interesting idea. I think it actually would be really fun, given that you may struggle to reach fluency in high school anyway. Like,
Yeah.
given that it's gonna be really hard to have sort of like a smorgasbord where you learn like a new language every month and you kind of get introduced to a little bit. That would be really cool because then maybe when the kids get to college or when they graduate from college, they've decided, oh, you know what, I really resonated with Finnish. Finnish was the one that I really was excited about. Now I'm going to go teach myself Finnish. You know, that's
Yeah.
and that's a
Good,
great idea. That'd be really cool. I wish I
yeah.
had that in high school.
Yeah,
My head.
yeah, it would be nice. Yeah. Yeah. Also, they have to find a teacher for French, for Polish,
Yeah.
for each
Or
language.
just like a month or 2 months. It's probably cheaper for the school district because they don't have to hire a full-time teacher, right?
Yeah,
But it's a lot of logistics, so.
yeah.
Yeah.
For example, in my school, I think the problem in my high school is like we were a lot. We were like 20 people, 120 students, right? It's difficult to learn a language
Yeah.
when you have 20 students or
All
something like
different
that.
levels.
Yeah. So, yeah, probably we should do smaller groups, but then we have to pay more teachers to have 3 or 4. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, mm,
Maybe not necessarily great, right? Because of the
Mm.
grading process that sometimes throws you off.
Right. Yeah, you just internalize that you're bad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
mm,
exactly.
mhm.
It's this one more about. I don't know what it's more about. But it's connected to what you said before, Gita, about the student that you have,
Ah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you didn't want to speak Spanish.
Yeah.
We know that the language that our mother tongue is or it's shaping our mind, right? And the way that we see the world.
Yeah.
What are the implications, or to what extent, or what is the impact? Because it is more about kids, about more than kids, because adults, we just make decisions, we just set some goals, I want to learn the language, and I do whatever I need to, or not, right, to learn the language. But if we're talking about kids and what happened to you, that you were exposed to Spanish at home, but then you just found yourself like, I'm not fluent. And also the kid that he wanted just to talk in French to his mom.
Yeah.
It's because maybe they were shaped in that way with that language. So what is the implication of the international schools like the teaching? Because the language of instruction is English. And what the English teachers are doing, no matter what languages they have in the classroom, that could be made.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
an international school, right?
Yeah.
Many languages in a class of 15 students, at least 5 different languages that we can find. So what are the implications of that teaching that is focused on English if they are transmitting or they are communicating their thoughts, their ways of seeing the world, their,
Yeah, yes.
what's the implications on that, like preservation of the languages that I have here in the group? When I am just doing a colonialism.
Yeah, no, it's really, it's a great question because I think inevitably those children are going to become more comfortable speaking about certain topics. I think probably a lot of you guys have had that experience studying in international schools. They'll be much more comfortable talking about concepts like historical concepts or democracy or things that you learn about in school in the language that they did their international schooling in. And then when they go back to, wherever they're from France, from Botswana, from India, they're going to struggle to talk about those concepts in their mother tongue. Unfortunately, that's just kind of how language works, right? Like, I think as parents, I do know some parents that have put a lot of work into making sure that their children are going to be functionally bilingual at an academic level, so that they're shuttling their kids back and forth from Japan to the US, making sure that they do as much of the Japanese school year as they can, and then the American school year, so that they can talk about certain concepts in both languages. But it does take a lot of work, right? I mean, there's only so many hours in the day that you can devote to learning languages. So at the end of the day, you kind of choose what you want to prioritize. But it's tough.
What is the new language you will learn next?
Oh,
You have one?
So I just started working on Polish.
Okay.
So I'm going to Poland for a conference in June. So this is my dabbling project. I'm not going to try to become fluent in Polish. I just want to know enough to like get the most out of the stay there. So that's my current project. Is Polish.
Right. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
We
thank you so
we will keep waiting for your book.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. See you soon, eh? Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Such a good question.
Okay,
Maybe we would-
bye bye. Some people here.